everyone, welcome. It is so good to be back with a new in-person interview after such a long time here at UMass Amherst student chapter of Informs. I am Büşra, I am a PhD student here and also an officer at our student chapter. And here we have a great guest here, Dr. Arzum Akkas, who is an assistant professor at Boston University Questrom School of Business. Welcome, Professor Akkas, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We have a number of questions that we are really excited to hear the answers to. But first, let's start with your background a little. Can you please tell us about your background and how you find the topics you feel passionate about solving with operations research tools? And
okay.
Yeah.
So I'm originally from Turkey. I'm in industrial engineering by training in undergrad, and I came to the US to do my master's at MIT in supply chain management. And I also got my PhD from MIT in engineering systems. I'm currently an assistant professor at Questrom School of Business. I'm teaching our core operations management class to our undergrads, and I'm also teaching an elective about sustainable supply chains, both to our MBA students and our undergrad students. My research focuses on sustainability, specifically food waste. And I came to the PhD for becoming an academic. I worked in industry for 8 years, mainly in the consumer packaged goods industry, and I did consulting also. So this is my background briefly.
It is, very impressive, and we will ask more about it later. And I actually wanted to ask, you are incorporating various empirical and data-driven methods into your research. In fact, during your presentation at the Early Career Sustainable Operations workshop here at Istanbul, you mentioned the collaboration with retail stores to observe the real-life impact of price discounts on brand image and sales. So would it be accurate to say that your industry experience and being directly involved in operations helped you to build this empirical approach for your research?
I think partly, definitely. So you need data to do empirical research, right? So I think my industry experience helps me to connect with industry partners better. It helps me because we can click better. They can see that I know what you're talking about. I can connect to them better. So it's easy for me to start collaborations. So that helps with empirical research. Also, generally about my interests, I'm a problem-driven researcher. That's what I call it. As opposed to a method-driven researcher, right? So you may be an expert in, let's say, game theory, and then you just apply game theory to different problems. I'm the opposite. I'm very passionate about the food waste problem, and I find different angles to study, different problems to analyze. And depending on the problem, I determine the appropriate research methodology. If my expertise in that method is not sufficient, I go out and reach out and find the people who are better than me in that particular method. So that's how I start collaborations. So that's the approach that I've been following.
Yeah. So a little bit related to that, a little bit related to your research. Have you ever encountered any surprising facts collaborating with real-life retailers and manufacturers?
So I'll tell you what I found surprising recently. So I was I'm doing research with an organization called ECR Retail Laws based in Europe, and my research is about understanding different food surplus management practices for retailers. Food surplus meaning you have extra food that are gonna near expiration, or you happen to buy a lot and you need to sell it quickly. So how do they exit it? Do they mark it down? Do they donate? Do they sell it to animal feed manufacturers, recycling, landfills? So there are different options. So to understand, to inform my interviews with them, to be able to talk with them better, I did some field study. I reached out to a few retailers, and then I visited their stores. We observed what happens to food after once they enter the exit path. And I also reached out to a non-profit organization called Loving Spoonfuls in Boston. They're a food rescue organization. So I found two surprising things working with it, spending a day with them. We call it route right, and we at PepsiCo, that's what we called it. Pepsi sales reps and delivery drivers. So the first day at the job, you need to have a route right to understand the business.
You're actually in the truck.
Exactly, right. You're in the truck delivering the products to retail stores, and you have the chance to observe the operation. So that's what I did with the food rescue organization. I got on the truck, we rescued food, and we delivered it to shelters and pantries. So two things that were surprising to me: participation to food donation programs vary by the department. Let's say, I'm just making it up, Stop and Shop. Totally making it up. So you go to one Stop and Shop and you get dairy and bread from them and meat. You go to another Stop and Shop, they only give you bread. Right? Because these are different departments: bakery, produce, like fresh meat. They're different departments, and the department managers decide whether they want to participate in the program. So at the corporate level, they get the data at the aggregate level, how much. So they report initially Feeding America gets all this information and gives feedback to different retailers. This is how much food you rescue. If the data is aggregated at the aggregate level, the corporate level will not have an idea that a given department has zero participation. So that is quite interesting to me, because you go to a store, you get bread, but all the produce waste goes to trash. So that I thought was very interesting.
That is very interesting.
Yeah. Another thing that I found interesting, we stopped by a store and there was a ton of plant-based meat in there. So it is driven by aggressive sales strategy, like meaning, so what we find at a retail store is not just driven by like what the consumer wants, right? It is also a function of what they want to sell you. So inventory drives sales, right? So I've seen some retailers, part of their sustainability strategy, that they want to push for more plant-based products. But this push sometimes has unintended consequences, that it creates waste because they're pushing something that the consumer is not ready to absorb yet. So I guess that's what I observed in that store, that there was a ton of Impossible Burger, a lot of plant-based food that we couldn't rescue as a food rescue organization, because they need variety. They need some produce, some milk, some bread, some meat. They cannot just like deliver a ton of Impossible Burger to a pantry. So that was I thought interesting.
That is interesting, and also the fact that you are in the field and you are able to observe
I
love
it. Yeah. I used to do that. I worked at Pepsi before, and part of my role was about I own the suggested order application that the sales reps use to create orders for retail stores. So I did it a lot with Pepsi. Like I had like days of 3 a.m. in the morning. You were the Walmart, stocking the shelves and talking to the sales reps, like understanding their issues so that I could improve the application. So yeah, I like spending time in the field. Yeah,
that is amazing. That is a very fresh approach to research and being a researcher.
Yeah.
And related to that, actually, could you maybe compare the levels of urgency to address and even to a certain extent prevent the retail level and consumer level food waste?
So in terms of percentages, waste at the consumer level is much bigger. Actually, retail level waste is like much smaller compared to consumer level waste. However, in terms of complexity, the complexity is much bigger at the retail level. For consumer level, I see that like there are basically two ways to address it. One is awareness. But by the way, it also differs across developing countries versus developed nations. In developed nations, consumer level waste is much bigger. In developing countries, it's much smaller because food prices are a bigger portion of their budget in developing nations, right? So it's our nature that we value things that are more expensive more. So if food is cheap, people don't value it, they waste it more. That's what's happening in developed nations. So two ways to address it. One is awareness. The second is we need really solid composting infrastructure. Like that waste should not go to landfill. So two solutions basically. Simple solutions, two solutions. But retail level waste is much more complex. Lots of dynamics going on, lots of trade-offs. So you need a lot of different actions to move the needle a little bit at the retail level, but the consumer level, I think you can get a biggest return on your action if you just, if the city has a composting program, for example.
But it's still refreshing to hear that there is something that we can do on the consumer side instead of just losing our home.
Be mindful of what you buy, be mindful of what is in your fridge, but it's all about awareness, right? If you're aware of the problem, you're more conscious about it.
Let's talk about a bit more about all the research topics that we so far mentioned. How different in nature and effectiveness do you think are the incentivizing strategies for external stakeholders like suppliers and customers and internal stakeholders such as employees and staff? And does the type of a supplier affect the best strategy to incentivize them?
So incentivizing in terms of reducing food waste, right? So that's how I'm going to answer the question. So for instance, the latest research that I'm doing, I'm interviewing with retailers from around the world, from the US, Europe, Australia, South Africa, and this is one of the questions that I'm asking, how do you engage the stores in your food waste reduction efforts? How do you engage hourly employees? So the answers that I get vary, but commonly, obviously, KPIs, right? KPIs number one. Training matters a lot. Store level employee associate training. And bonuses, although it's not very common, only a portion of the companies that I interviewed told me that the bonuses of certain employees are tied to food waste related targets. So that's not always the case. In terms of engaging external stakeholders, it's again not very common. Companies mainly focus on what is within their own walls, but what I've seen some companies try to pull in suppliers in the same direction. So they share best practices. They look at the food waste in their space. Walmart, actually, I give this example in my sustainability class. Generally, it's an example generally about sustainability. Walmart has a project called Project Gigaton. Gigaton, yeah. It's about reducing 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through their supplier engagement. But they have all kinds of different suppliers, right? They cannot tell, it is too complex to manage all these suppliers. So what the project entails is they make the suppliers determine what areas they're going to work on, what is the baseline measurement, and how they progress over time. So it is kind of they do their own thing within their own walls, and it's like a locomotive pulling the the cars, and they try to move the suppliers in the same direction, but they make them identify the opportunity areas and follow through those opportunities. I think that's a good one. In terms of customers, again, through my interviews through retailers, I haven't seen that much, but generally increasing awareness about food waste helps. But retailers' main concern is to get rid of food waste from their own stores, right? So there's less of a thinking about how much food is wasted at the consumer. But generally, if you increase the awareness about food waste, consumers will be aware of it in their own homes too. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hopefully. So this is actually about consumers, this question. So nowadays we see many eco-labels in retailers such as non-GMO, fair trade, Rainforest Alliance, and so on. So do you think this recent change in consumer demand for sustainable and maybe ethical food options has an impact on how food waste is managed on the manufacturer side and on the retailer side?
Absolutely. Again, I'll quote my recent research. So what I heard some retailers in Europe especially telling me that their sustainability and food waste management strategy is driven by the consumer's demand, because there's so much awareness in certain countries in Europe, a lot better than compared to US. So it shapes their sustainability strategy and food waste strategy. But generally, I talk about this in my sustainability class. What are the drivers for what is driving companies to work on sustainability? Consumer demand is one thing, but there's also a lot of pressure from NGOs and investors. I think that's the biggest impact, and regulations. If I have to guess, I have no research on it, but like that's where the biggest momentum is coming from, I think. And also, there's cost savings related to a lot of sustainability initiatives, right? Like if you read, about food waste, if you waste less, it's going to increase your profits.
Yeah.
So there's a win-win when it comes to like some initiatives. But I feel like consumers are not the biggest impact, I think, in this equation. Like the most thing that consumers care about is their budget and savings, right? Yeah,
that makes sense. So again, from a consumer and brand image perspective, how and to what extent do you think the packaging is related to food waste and sustainability in food supply chains, do you think?
A lot. So think about like a plastic bottle. Like for instance, when I worked at Pepsi, like coffee bottles used to be a lot thicker. So over time they thin the bottles, reduce the plastic in it, they shorten the caps. So that's a win-win again. That it means they spend less money on materials and it creates less plastic waste. But you have to be careful about it. I also seen at a warehouse, not at a Pepsi warehouse, but somewhere else. Like a pallet of bottled water was crushed because it was thinned so much that you cannot stack it and it cannot be dribbled along the supply chain, right? So there is an optimum balance to it. If you reduce the purpose of packaging is to keep the product intact throughout the supply chain, right? It protects the product. You need some level of packaging, enough so that it stays intact in the supply chain, but not too little, otherwise it's going to damage the product. If too much, obviously it's going to create packaging waste. So that's one aspect to it. The other aspect is the type of packaging, like for instance biodegradable packaging, right? So I heard from some retailers that biodegradable packaging reduces shelf life. I don't know if it is true for all types, but this is like from one retailer that I heard. So if that's the case, if you have less shelf life, right, you're gonna have like more expiration problem. So there's a trade-off again. So if there's technology that that figures out a way to extend the shelf life and use like more environmental friendly packaging, that will be win-win.
Yeah. Maybe in the future.
Maybe it already exists. I don't know.
Yeah. A good research topic. So, in your work to determine maximum shipping age, now we are diving a little bit more into your research. You reached out to European distributors. And could you compare the food waste management strategies taken by European and the US-based retailers? I know we talked about this a little, but let's just talk about it a little bit more.
So this is actually pretty much what my latest research is about. I'm surveying different retailers from around the world, understand the differences. I got the sense that Europe is like one level above US. But it's generally the case about anything related to sustainability. One thing that I found was like the treatment of like markdowns, for instance. Some in the US, I found that a lot of retailers are concerned about their brand image when it comes to marking down aged items. But like one European country, it is such a norm. They are so big into markdowns. So I see these like regional differences, and also another difference is again coming from regulations. Like one country, I found that cost of landfill is more expensive than cost of recycling food. So I think it's on purpose. Regulators made the price landfill so high so that things do not go in that direction. And that's the only country that I found, actually. In the US, we have food waste ban, right, in 10 states. They're not allowed to send things like food waste to landfills. In that case, the two prices are comparable. Yeah, I think like it's just that's how the market ended up working.
Yeah.
But yeah, in a different country in Europe, it's more expensive to dump things in the landfill.
And that's just one country in Europe?
Yeah, it may be more. I just was able to confirm the number from one country. Yeah, a lot of retailers that I interviewed do not have this knowledge. Like one person that I interviewed, he knew just a lot about like various aspects of the business. So.
Wow. So this was about the retailer side, about that comparison between the two. How about the same comparison, but this time between EU and US retail customers?
I think, again, like European consumers are more aware of the problem. That's the sense that I got, you know.
And again, another comparison between different nations. Could you talk a bit about sustainability issues and food waste in the developing nations? We talked about US and EU, and how about more developing nations?
So the main difference is the distribution across the supply chain, like meaning how much waste occurs at the farm versus in processing versus at the retail and consumer. In developing nations, like biggest percentage is at the farm, and in distribution because of lack of infrastructure. In developed nations, the largest portion happens at the consumer side because food is too cheap compared to the rest of the items people buy, and people don't value it. I guess that's the reason why people waste food. So in like for instance, let's compare like Turkey versus US, right? Like here we buy a lot of things off season, and things come from Peru or Chile or Mexico because you have the logistical infrastructure. So in Turkey, like it's very rare that everything is like local, and things can like barely make it to like a big bazaar in a big city. And
there's such a thing as like seasonal fruit, seasonal vegetable,
because that's your only option. Because first of all, the country provides in the south of the country there's sun and there's land, and but at the same time we don't have the similar logistical infrastructure in Turkey. For instance, in India is notorious about it. A lot of grains are wasted because they don't have storage facilities. When they have an abundant season, they don't have enough warehouses to store them, so they get wasted. So infrastructure is a bigger problem in developing nations.
So we are approaching the end of this interview, and at this final segment of our interview, we would like to explore your extensive industry experience a bit more. We talked about it at the beginning. Let's talk about it a little bit more. So prior to your academic career, you have excelled in areas such as consulting and logistics. And in fact, the systems that you developed as an operations manager in Pepsi Bottling Group are still being used worldwide, which is very impressive. So can you talk about what made you decide to pursue a PhD after such accomplishments in industry?
That's a great question. And I get these questions all the time. And you know what I say? I was young and I was looking for trouble. Joking aside, I was young and I was very curious and I wanted to do more. I got like bored of my job at the time because I fixed this. What is next? I fixed that too. I just I could absorb more things and I had a lot of energy. So it was very natural for me to go back to school and do more. So I guess I was ambitious about doing a lot of things and I was curious. So that's the reason.
All that problem solving, had to lead to more education and more problem solving in research. That makes so much sense. And so what were the advantages and disadvantages of working in industry before getting your PhD degree? And how did this experience affect your approach to research and life as a graduate student? All that.
So pluses and minuses. Minuses, when you have a gap in education, you forget your skills, you forget your knowledge, you forget math, you forget statistics, right? You have to relearn all these things. That's a disadvantage. Another disadvantage is I was out of sync with my colleagues in terms of age. I was older. So that's a disadvantage. But there are a lot of advantages. Like I can give in the classroom lots of experience, a lot of examples based on my experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think knowing nuts and bolts of operations well helps me like write the papers better, and I think I can respond to referee better.
Very important skill.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, it also informs like my research agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think like pluses outweigh the minuses, I would say.
Definitely. Yeah. Even in this interview, we heard from your research, but also from your industry experience, which made it quite more interesting. To close our conversation on a high note, what advice would you give to PhD students trying to decide between staying in academia and working in industry after they graduate? And I'm asking this as a PhD student, so it's very relevant to me.
So my advice is to understand what you're getting into.
Mm-hmm.
How can you understand it without getting in there yourself? By talking to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to a lot of people in academia and industry. Ask them what they like, what they don't like, what their job looks like, what do they do every day. So collect all this information and decide, would you like one thing versus the other thing? And you need to know yourself too, like what gets you excited. But it's very important to gather this knowledge and understand what those worlds look like with their pluses and minuses. And also there's a lot of variation in industry jobs, right? There's a lot of variation. In academic jobs, usually like life is like more similar from one school to another, one job to another. So it is important to be aware of it. Like you talk to 3 people and they're all doing the same type of job in industry, that's not enough information for you to try to get information for like a array of different types of jobs. So then figure out like what is best for you, what will make you happy.
At the end, it all depends on us.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akkas, for this brilliant interview. And also, we would like to thank our officers and also our faculty advisor, Professor Anna Nagarni, for this amazing day of learning and experiencing together with Professor Akkas. So stay tuned for more interviews from us. Thank you so much once again.